Welcome to Paper Cuts, everybody. Last we left off, we were in the harrowing tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and um, as I recall, the inspector and the butler had just burst into the room with Dr. Jekyll, and they weren't quite sure what was going on. And now we return with the chapter Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope, addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I'd seen the man, dined with him, indeed, just the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify a formality of registration. The contents further increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. 10th December, 18 XDX. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any proper break in our affection. There was never a day when, if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason depend upon you, I would not have sacrificed my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honor, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose, after all this preface, that I'm going to ask you for something dishonorable to grant, and, well, judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor to take a cab, unless your carriage should actually be at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has his orders. You will find him awaiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced, and you are to go in alone, to open the glazed press, letter E on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out with all its contents as they stand, the fourth drawer from the top, or, which is the same thing, the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you. But even if I am, well, in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents, some powders, a file, and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square, exactly as it stands. That is the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on the receipt of this, long before midnight, but I will leave you that amount of margin. Not only the fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death, or perhaps just the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour in a strange place, laboring under a darkness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, H.J. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It's possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more, expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon the reading of the letter, I made sure my colleague was insane, but till that was proved beyond the possibility of doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from the house, got into a hansom, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival. He had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, and had sent at once for a locksmith and carpenter. The tradesmen came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theatre, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. The door was very strong and the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed he would have great trouble and have to do much damage if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this last was a handy fellow, and after a few hours' work, the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied in a sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of a dispensing chemist, so that it was plain that they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of a white color. The phial to which I next turned my attention might have been, say, half full of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book, and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here and there a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, double occurring perhaps 6 times in total of several hundred entries, and once very early in the list and followed by several marks of exclamation, total failure. All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. Here was a phial of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honor, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more I convinced myself that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease. And though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some sort of posture of self-defense. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London ere the knocker sounded very gently on the door. I went myself at the summons, and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. "Are you come from Dr. Jekyll?" He told me yes by a constrained gesture, and when I had bid them enter, he didn't obey me without a searching backward glance into the darkness of the square. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's eyes open, and at the sight I thought my visitors started and made greater haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, rather disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room, I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here at last I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I'd never set eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I've said. I was struck, besides, with the shocking expression of his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution, and last but certainly not least, with the odd, subjective disturbance caused by his neighborhood. This bore some resemblance to incipient rigor, and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. At the time I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste, and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms. But I've since had reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of the man, and to turned on some nobler hinge than simply the principle of hatred. This person, who had thus, from the first moment of his entrance, struck in me what I can only describe as a disgustful curiosity, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measurement, the trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of the coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. It was strange to relate this ludicrous accoutrement was accoutrement? Do you say that accoutrement or accoutrement? Let's find out. Let's open the dictionary and find out here. Accoutrement. Yeah, that's a schwa, so accoutrement. Usually accoutrements. Additional items of dress or equipment, or other items carried or worn by a person or used for a particular activity. The accoutrement of a religious ritual. Anyway, strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from moving me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, and revolting, this fresh disparity seemed but to fit in with and reinforce it, so that my interest to the man's nature and character, there was an added curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with somber excitement. "Have you got it? Have you got it?" And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. "Come, sir, you forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example, and sat down myself in my customary seat, and with as fair an imitation of my as fair an imitation of my ordinary manner to a patient as the lateness of the hour, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror that I had of my visitor would suffer me to muster. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyard," he replied civilly enough. "What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to my politeness. I come here at the insistence of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understood—" He paused and put his hand to his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, he was wrestling against the approaches of hysteria. "I understood a drawer." But here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," said I, pointing to the drawer, where it lay on the floor, behind the table, and still covered with a sheet. He sprang to it, and then paused, and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws, and his face was so ghastly to see that I grew both alarmed for his life and his reason. "Compose yourself." At this he turned a dreadful smile to me, and, as if with the decision of despair, plucked away the sheet. At the sight of the contents he uttered one loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified, and the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control, Have you a graduated glass?" I rose from my place with something of an effort, and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mixture, which at first of a reddish hue, began, in proportion as the crystals melted, to brighten in color, to effervesce audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapor. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again, more slowly this time, to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. "And now to settle what remains. Will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand, and to go forth from your house without further parley? Or has the greed of curiosity had too much command of you? Think before you answer." Shoutouts to Frank, who's barking for no apparent reason. I don't know what you're on about, dog. At least he's not coming in here. He's learned his lesson there. Anyway. Has the greed of curiosity too much command of you? Think before you answer. It shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser. Distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul. Or so shall you prefer to choose a new province of knowledge, and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you here in this room upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan himself. "Sir," said I, affecting a coolness that I was far from possessing, "you speak enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no very strong impression of belief. But I've gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before I see the end." "It is well," replied the visitor. "Lanyon, you remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession. And now, you who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, you who have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine, you who have derided your superiors, behold." He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed, and he reeled, staggering. He clutched at the table and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with an open mouth, and as I looked there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell, his face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter, and the next moment I had sprung to my feet and leapt back against the wall, my arms raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. "Oh, oh God! Oh God!" I screamed again and again, for there before my eyes, pale and shaken and half fainted, groping before him with his hands like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. What he told me in the next hour I can't bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it. And yet now, when that sight has faded from my eyes, I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night. I feel that my days are numbered, that I must die, and yet I must die incredulous. As for the moral turpitude... Turpitude? Ah, dang it. I was on a roll there. How's this word? How do you say this word? Hang on, that's a schwa. Turpitude. Yeah, I did say it right. Gosh dang it, I was on a roll. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, even with tears of penitence I cannot, even in memory, dwell on it without a start of horror. I will say but one thing, Utterson, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for, in every corner of the land, as the murder of Carew. Hasty Lanyon. Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. I was born in the year 18xdx, to a large fortune, endowed besides with excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise and good among my fellow men, and thus, as might have been supposed, with every degree of an honourable and distinguished future. And indeed the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such as I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high, and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I had already stood committed to a profound duplicity of life. Many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations than any particular degradation in my faults that made me what I was, and with an even deeper trench than in the majority of men, severed me in those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound man's dual nature. In this case I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterally. Good heavens, that's a good word. In this case I was driven to reflect deeply and inveterally on that hard law of life, which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. Gosh, I said that word wrong, didn't I? Inveterately. There we go. If you are of an editing mind, you could dub that in, I'm sure. Though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite, and both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame, than when I labored in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering. And it chanced that the direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly toward the mystic and transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light on this consciousness of the perennial war among my members. With every day, and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I drew thus steadily nearer to that truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me in the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advanced infallibly in one direction, and in one direction only. It was on the moral side, and in my own person, that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both. And from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle, I had learned to dwell with pleasure, as a beloved daydream, on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. The unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. It was the curse of mankind that these I'm not saying that word. Sorry, not incongruous. That's a perfectly good word. There is a word that has vastly changed meanings. In this case, it is intended to mean a bundle of sticks. It is not what it means anymore, and I'm not saying it for the dignity of the stream, especially not in June of all months. Good heavens. But I've tiptoed around the word that, anyway, that these incongruous wood piles were thus bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness these polar twins should be continuously struggling. How, then, were they disassociated? I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a sidelight began to shine upon the subject from the laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it has ever yet been stated the trembling immaterial... Dang, I'm just getting dunked on by these words tonight. The trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience of this certainly so solid body, in which we walk attired. Certain agents I've found to have the power to shake and pluck back that fleshly vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. For two good reasons I won't enter deeply into this scientific branch of my confession. First, because I have been made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, it returns upon us with more unfamiliar and awful pressure. Second, because, as my narrative will make, alas, too evident, my discoveries were unfortunately incomplete. Enough, then, that I not only recognized my natural body from the mere aura and effulgence of certain of the powers that made up my spirit, but managed to compound a drug, by which these powers should be dethroned from their supremacy, and a second form and countenance substituted, none the less natural to me because they were the expression, and bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul. I hesitated long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I knew well that I risked death, for any drug that so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of the identity might, by at least the scruple of an overdoser, the least inopportunity in the moment of an exhibition, utterly blot out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound at last overcame the suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once from a firm of wholesale chemists a large quantity of a particular salt, which I knew from my experiments to be the last ingredient required. And late one accursed night I compounded the elements and watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when the ebullition had subsided, with a strong glow of courage, drank off the potion. The most racking pains succeeded, a grinding in my bones, deadly nausea, a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth nor death. Then these agonies began swiftly to subside, and I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and, from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in my body. Within I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act I was suddenly aware that I had lost in stature. There was no mirror in that date at my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later on, and for the very purpose of these transformations. The night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard wherein the constellations looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder the first creature of that sort that their unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors, a stranger in my own home, and coming to my room I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to be most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just deposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted. And hence, as I think, it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and, well, younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on that body an imprint of deformity and decay. And yet when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather a leap of welcome. This too was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes it bore a livelier image of the spirit, and it seemed more express and single than the imperfect and divided countenance I'd been hitherto accustomed to call mine. And in so far I was doubtless right. I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none could come near me at first without a visible misgiving of the flesh. This, I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. I lingered but a moment at the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted. It yet remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption, and must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. And hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, the stature, and the face of Henry Jekyll. That night I had come to the fatal crossroads. Here had I approached my discovery in a more noble spirit. Had I risked the experiment while under the empire of the generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, and from these agonies of birth and death I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine, but it shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition, and like the captives of Philippi, that which stood within it ran forth. At that time my virtue slumbered, and my evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize the occasion, and the thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. Hence, although I had now two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil, and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. The movement was thus wholly toward the worse. Even at the time I had not conquered my aversions to the dryness of a life of study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on this side that my new power tempted me, until I fell in slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume, like a thick cloak, that of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time to be most humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. I took and furnished that house in Soho, to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and engaged as a housekeeper a creature whom I knew well to be silent and unscrupulous. On the other side I announced to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, whom I described, was to have full liberty and power about my house in the square, and to parry mishaps I even called and made myself a familiar object, in my second character. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without pecuniary loss. And thus fortified as I supposed on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunities of my position. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first ever that did so for his pleasures. I was the first that could plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment, like a schoolboy, strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me and my impenetrable mantle the safety was complete. Think of it, I didn't even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the drop that I had always standing ready, and whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away, like the stain of a breath upon a mirror. And there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion, would be Henry Jekyll. The pleasures which I have made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I've said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde they soon began to turn toward the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. This familiar that I called out of my own soul, and sent forth alone to do his good pleasure, was a being that was inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on himself, drinking pleasure with bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another, relentless like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws, and insidiously relaxed the grasp of conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities, seemingly unimpaired. He would even make haste, where it was possible, to undo the evil done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of the infamy at which I thus connived, for even now I can scarce grant that I committed it, I have no design of entering. I mean but to point out the warnings and successive steps with which my chastisement approached. I met with one accident which, as it brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognized the other day in the person of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him. There were moments when I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their too just resentment, Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them in a check drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and when by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and when, by sloping my own hand backward, I had supplied my double with a signature, I thought I sat beyond the reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out for one of my adventures, had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain that I looked about me, in vain that I saw the decent furniture and tall proportions of my room in the square, in vain that I recognized the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in Soho, where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself, and in my psychological way began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comfortable morning doze. I was still so engaged when, in one of my more wakeful moments, my eyes fell upon my hand. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you've often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely. But the hand which I now saw, clearly enough, in the yellow light of a mid-London morning, lying half shut on the bedclothes, was lean, quarter, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shaded with a swart growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for near half a minute, sunk as I was in the mere stupidity of wonder, before terror woke up in my chest, as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from my bed I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed a Henry Jekyll, but I had awakened Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained, I asked myself. and then with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up, all my drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 pairs of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theatre, from where I was then standing horror-struck. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the coming and going of my second self. I had soon dressed, as well as I was able, in clothes of my own size. I had soon passed through the house, where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour and in such a strange array. And 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll had returned to his own shape, and was sitting down with a darkened brow to make a feint of breakfasting. Small indeed was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, the reversal of my previous experience, seemed, like the Babylonian finger on the wall, to be spelling out the letters of my judgment, and I began to reflect more seriously than ever on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished. It had seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though, when I wore that form, I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger that, if this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown, the power of voluntary change be forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde become irretrievably mine. The power of the drug had not always been equally displayed. Once very early in my career it had totally failed me, and since then I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once with infinite risk of death to treble the amount, and these rare uncertainties had cast hitherto the sole shadow on my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accident, I was led to remark that, whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Jekyll, it had been of late, gradually but decidedly, transferred itself to the other side. All things therefore seemed to point to this, that I was slowly losing hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worst. Between these two I now felt I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but all other faculties were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, now with the most sensitive apprehensions, now with a greedy gusto, projected and shared in the pleasures and adventures of Hyde, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll, or but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he conceals himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. To cast my lot in with Jekyll was to die in those appetites which I had long secretly indulged and had of late begun to pamper. To cast it in with Hyde, which was to die to 1,000 interests and aspirations, and to become, at a blow and forever, despised and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration in the scales. For while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would not even be conscious of all that he had lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinner. And it fell out with me, as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, that I chose the better part, and was found wanting in the strength to keep to it. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontented doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and bade a resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, leaping impulses, and secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of Hyde. I made this choice, perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho, nor did I destroy the clothes of Edward Hyde, which still lay ready in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination, For 2 months I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time it began at last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. The praises of conscience began to grow into a thing, of course. I began to be tortured with throes and longings, as of Hyde struggling after freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. I don't suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times afflicted by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility, and neither had I, as long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by these that I was punished. My devil had long been caged, and such he came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul that tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare, at least before God, that no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts, by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness among temptations, and in my case to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. Instantly the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. With a transport of glee I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow, and it wasn't ill weariness that had begun to succeed, that I was suddenly, in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed. I saw my life to be forfeit, and fled from the scene of these excesses, at once glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated, my love of life screwed to the topmost peg. I ran to the house in Soho, and, to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers. Thence I set out through the lamplit streets, in the same divided ecstasy of mind, gloating on my crime, light-headedly devising others of the future, and yet still hastening and still hearkening in my wake for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it pledged the dead man. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing him before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to the heavens. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it up from the days of my childhood when I had walked with my father's hand, and through the self-denying toils of my professional life, to arrive again and again, with the same sense of unreality, at the horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me. And still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible. Whether I would or would not, I was now confined to the better part of my existence. And oh, how I rejoiced to think of it! With what willing humanity I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life! With what sincere renunciation I looked and locked upon the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. The next day came the news that the murder had not been overlooked, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world, and that the victim was a man high in public estimation. It wasn't only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think I was glad to know it. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hands of all men would be raised to take and slay him. I resolved in my future conduct to redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly, in the last months of the long year, I labored to relieve suffering. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily, for myself. Nor can I truly say that I wearied of this beneficent and innocent life. I think it was instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely. But I was still cursed with my duality of purpose, and as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged, so recently chained down, began to growl for license. Not that I dreamed of resurrecting Hyde. The bare idea of that would startle me to frenzy. No, it was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience. And it was an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of the temptation. Not that I dreamed of resuscitating Hyde. The bare idea of that would startle me to frenzy. No. It was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience, and it was as an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assaults of temptation. There comes an end to all things. The most capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief condescension to evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. And yet I wasn't alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I had made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent's Park was full of winter chirrupings and a sweet spring odor. I sat in the sun, on a bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, the spiritual side a little drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors. And then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea and a most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me faint. And then, in its turn, the faintness subsided. I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts, a greater boldness, a contempt of danger, a solution of the bonds of obligation. I looked down, and my clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs. The hand that lay on my knee was corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved, the cloth laying for me the dining table at home, and now I was the common quarry of all mankind, hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows. My reason wavered, but it didn't fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that in my second character my faculties seemed sharpened to a point, and my spirits came more tensely elastic. Thus it came about that where Jekyll perhaps might have succumbed, Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw I must employ another hand, and thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Supposing that I escaped capture in the streets, how was I to make my way into his presence, and how should I, an unknown and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague, Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character one part remained to me. I could write my own hand, and once I had conceived that kindling spark, the way I must follow became lighted up from end to end. Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best I could, and, summoning a passing hansom, drove to an hotel in Portland Street, the name of which I chanced to remember. At my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however tragic a fate these garments covered, the driver could not conceal his mirth. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face. Happy for him, yet more happily for myself, in another instant I'd certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so dark a countenance I made the attendants tremble. Not a look did they exchange in my presence, but obsequiously took my orders, led me to a private room, and brought me wherewithal to write. Hyde, in danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaking with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of murder, lusting to inflict pain. And yet, the creature was astute, mastered his fury with a great effort of the ill, composed his 2 important letters, and one to Lanyon and one to Poole, and that he might receive actual evidence of their being posted, sent them out with directions that they should be registered. Thenceforward he sat all day over the fire, in the private dining room, gnawing at his nails. There he dined. Sorry, I lost my place. Yes, gnawing his nails. There he dined, sitting alone with his fears, the waiter visibly quailing before his eye. And thence, when the night was fully on, he set forth in the corner of the closed cab, and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. I cannot say. That river of hell had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hatred. And when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and began to grow suspicious, and ventured in on foot, now attired in misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, into the midst of nocturnal powers, rather. Oh, sorry, I lost my place. Closed cab. He cannot say. Cannot say. The child of hell had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hatred. And when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot, attired in his misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, and into the midst of the nocturnal passengers, these 2 base passions raged within him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, skulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that still divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. When I came back to myself at Lanyon's, the horror of my old friend perhaps afflicted me somewhat. I don't know. It was at least but a drop in the sea, the abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows, it was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. I received Landon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream that I came home to my own house and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day, and with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me would awake. I awoke in the morning, shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still hated the thought of the brute that slept within me, and I had not, of course, forgotten the appalling dangers. But I was once more at home in my own house and close to my drugs, and gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul that it almost rivaled the brightness of hope. I was stepping leisurely across the court with breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that heralded the change, and I had but time to gain the shelter. I was seized again by those indescribable urges that heralded the change, and I had but time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passions of Hyde. It took on this occasion a double dose to recall me to myself, and alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned, and the drug had to be re-administered. In short, from that day forth, it seemed only by a great effort, as of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night I'd be taken with the premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened. Under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleeplessness to which I had now condemned myself, even beyond what I had thought possible to man, I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by forever, languidly weak in both body and mind, and solely occupied by one thought, the horror at my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of transformation grew daily less marked, into the possession of a fancy brimming with images of terror, a soul boiling with causeless hatreds, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickness of Jekyll. And certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on both sides. With Jekyll it was a thing of vital instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of that creature that shared with him some of the phenomena of consciousness, and was co-heir with him to death. And beyond these links of community, which in themselves made the poignant part of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish, but inorganic. This was the shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead, and had no shape, could or should usurp the offices of life. And this again, that insurgent horror that was knit to him closer than a wife, closer than an eye. It lay caged in his flesh, where he heard it mutter and felt it struggle to be born, and at every hour of weakness and the confidence of slumber prevailed against him and deposed him out of life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was of a different order. His terror on the gallows drove him continually to temporarily end things and return to his subordinate station of a part instead of a person. But he loathed the necessity, he loathed the despondency into which Jekyll was now fallen, and he resented the dislike with which he was himself regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father, and indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me in the ruin. But his love of me is wonderful. I go further, I, who sicken and freeze the mere thought of him, when I recall the abjection and passion of this attachment, and when I know how he fears my power to cut him off, I find it in my heart to pity him. It is useless, and the time awfully fails me to prolong this description. No one has ever suffered such torments. Let that suffice. And yet even to these habit brought, no, not alleviation, but a certain callousness of soul, a certain acquiescence of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years, but for the last calamity which has now fallen, and which has finally severed me from my own face and nature. My provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the date of the first experiment, began to run low. I sent out for a fresh supply and mixed the draught. The ebullition followed, and the first change of color, but not the second. I drank it and was without efficiency. You will learn from Poole now I have had London ransacked, and it was in vain. I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was that unknown impurity which lent efficacy to the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of the old powders. Then this is the last time, short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts or see his own face, now how sadly altered, in the glass. Nor must I delay too long to bring my writing to an end. For if my narrative has hitherto escaped destruction, it has been by a combination of great prudence and great good luck. Should the throes of change take me in the act of writing it, Hyde will tear it in pieces. But if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wonderful selfishness and circumscription to the moment will probably save it once again from the action of his ape-like spite. And indeed the doom that is closing in on us both has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever re-endue that hated personality, I know how I shall sit, shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening, to pace up and down this room, my last earthly refuge, and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold, or will he find courage to release himself at the last moment? Heaven only knows. I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what is to follow concerns another than myself. Here, then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. And, fittingly, that's the end of our story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. At this point, if you're listening to the recording, or if you're listening on stream, honestly, if you've been sitting, if you've been not moving for that matter, I would firmly suggest just walking away for a little while, getting your blood moving, do some jumping jacks, a couple push-ups, something. You gotta remain active. It's not good for you to sit still for more than an hour, even at my job, they're aware of that, and they kind of let us stand up and walk around every 90 minutes or so. But I'm going to put up the BRB, give you all a chance to wander around for a little while, maybe get some snacks, take a short break, and when we come back, I think we're going to be reading The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, because it's similar in tenor, I would say, to the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, do come back for that. Welcome back. I assume if you're watching the recording and you went to go fetch some water, wander around for a little bit, you just paused the video, but welcome back. We're going to dive right into The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember. It was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease, from my books surcease of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, this it is and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door." Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortals ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore. Merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within my burning, soon again I heard a tapping, something louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what threat this is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then the ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on that placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if its soul in one word he did outpour. Nothing farther then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore." But the raven, still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door, Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy on to fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, respite, and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still of bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aiden it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeing of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight over him streaming throws his shadows on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. I gotta admit, I got a little into that. Like, more than a little into that. There's just something about the Raven, man. It gets like it has this beat to it, you know. It's a poem. It's supposed to be a poem, and it has like the perfect beat. It really lets you lean into your cadence and really sell it. You know, it's a piece of literature, man. I don't know, since we're on the Edgar Allan Poe kick, and I certainly don't have time for The Invisible Man or Around the World in 80 Days, or certainly not Dracula. Dracula's going to take me like a few weeks. I think we might as well lean into this Edgar Allan Poe kick. I forgot how short The Raven is, and we've got a good 20-30 minutes. I don't know, or should we cut it short? Because I don't remember how long the Cask of Amontillado is. I don't know, man, let's, because the Cask of Amontillado is just one act, isn't it? Yeah, the Cask of Amontillado is like one act. And, my Kindle's estimating 9 minutes. So, you know what, I got time. And it's the weekend, man. I got time. Let's lean into this, Edgar Allan Poe kick. Let's change the name around to the Cask of Amontillado. Hopefully this one lasts a little longer. Cask of Amontillado. No, that's not a command. I should make like a command that's like Amontillado and like it stacks a brick into the wall or something. That'd be cute. I might do that game. I want to change the game to the Cask of Amontillado. Because I think that's what I'm gonna. That's just branding wise what I want to do with Paper Cuts on Twitch, is just have the title be Paper Cuts and then change the game every time we change a story. Anyway, let's Let's get into The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. The thousand injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult I vowed revenge. You who so well know the nature of my soul will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitely settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It's equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt, as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my good will. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he didn't perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and perhaps even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the virtuoso spirit. For the most part their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time and opportunity, to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery Fortunato, like his old countrymen, was a quack, but in the matter of old wines he was, well, sincere. In this respect I didn't differ from him materially. I was skilful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely, whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening, during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking rather forcefully. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting, party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I've received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How? Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival?"
"I have my doubts, and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain. You know."
"Amontillado?"
I have my doubts,
"Amontillado?
and I must satisfy them.
Amontillado?"
As you are engaged, I'm on my way to Lucchesi. If anyone has a critical turn, it's he. He will tell me.
"Lucchesi can't tell Amontillado from sherry."
And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own.
"Come, let us go."
"Whither?"
"To your vaults."
"My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement. Lucchesi—"
"I have no engagement. Come."
"My dear friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They're encrusted with nitre."
"Let us go, nevertheless. The cold is merely nothing. Amontillado, you've been imposed upon. And as for Lucchesi, as I've said, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm. Putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaire closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. Okay, I gotta know. What's a roquelaire? Roquelaire, no definition found. Of course it's not gonna be in the English dictionary. That's not an English word. English doesn't have cool words like roquelaire. Let's see what the internet says. Roquelaire. What's this? Roquelaire, a knee-length cloak worn especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Alright. Okay. So pretty standard, like, there's a chill, and I'm gonna put on my knee-length cloth. Makes sense, makes sense. Good choice. Anyway, let's continue. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in the honor of the time. I told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and, giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into my vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady at best, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. The pipe.
It's further on, but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls.
He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the room of intoxication. Nitra? He asked at length.
Nitra? Yes. How long have you had that cough?
My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. It's nothing.
Oh, come now, I said with decision. We'll go back. Your health is precious. You're rich, respected, admired, beloved. If you're happy as once I was, you're a man to be missed. For me, it's no matter. We'll go back. You'll be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there's Lucchesi.
Enough, the cough is a mere nothing. It won't kill me. I shall not die of a cough.
True, true, and indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but, well, you should use your proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps, I suppose.
Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle, which I drew from a long row of its fellows, that lay upon the mould.
Here, drink,
I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer, and paused to nod to me familiarly while his bells jingled. I drink to the buried that repose around us.
And I to your long life.
He again took my arm, and we proceeded. These vaults are extensive.
The Montresors were a great and numerous family, you see.
I forget your arms.
A huge human foot door in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel.
And the motto?
Nemo me impune lascesit.
Good. The wine sparkled in his eyes, and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the Medoc. We passed through walls of piled bones with casks and puncheons intermingling, into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. Hang on, before we continue. I have to think about this Latin pronunciation if I did it right. What's church Latin? I know I'm saying this in church Latin, so it doesn't really. Yeah, impune la ce sit. Nemo me impune lacessit. Yes. Sorry, I had to make double sure that I said that right. Because it was going to bother me if I didn't. Anyway. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow.
The Nitra! See, it increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We're below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we'll go back. Ere it's too late, your cough.
It's nothing. Let us go on, but I suppose another draught of the Medoc first. I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath, and his eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with gesticulations I didn't understand. I looked at him in surprise, and he repeated the movement. It was a grotesque one. You do not comprehend?
Not I.
Then you are not of the Brotherhood.
How?
You are not of the Masons.
Yes, 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 yes.
You impossible. A mason?
A mason?
A sign, a sign.
It is this,
I answered, producing my trowel from beneath the folds of my roquelaire. You jest, he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. But let us proceed to the Amontillado.
Be it so,
I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily, and we continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descended again, arrived at a deep crypt, in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeaux rather to glow than just to flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains piled to the vault overhead, in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th side the bones had been thrown down and lain promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall thus exposed by the displacing of these bones, we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, and in height about 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but formed merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depths of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see.
do proceed. Herein is the Amontillado. As for Lucchesi,
He's an ignoramus, interrupted my friend, and he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I had him fettered to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples, distant from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. I threw the links about his waist, but it was the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess.
pass your hand over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. Indeed, it's very damp. Once more let me implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you, but first I must render you all the little attentions in my power.
The Amontillado, shouted my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment.
True, the Amontillado.
As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low, groaning cry from the depth of the recess. It wasn't the cry of a drunken man, that was sure. There was a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and then the third, and the fourth, and then I heard furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labours and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interruption the 5th, 6th, and 7th tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my chest. I again paused, and, holding the flambeau over the mason-work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated and trembled. I unsheathed my rapier and began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall and replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed, I aided, I surpassed them in volume and in strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position. But now there came from the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke indeed, an excellent jest. We'll have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo. Over our wine." "Yeah, the Amontillado." "Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo? The lady, Fortunato, and the rest. Let us be gone." "Yes, let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montresor." "Yes, for the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato." No answer, and so I called again, "Fortunato." There was still no answer. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture, and let it fall within. There came forth in reply only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs, and I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into its position, and I plastered it up. Against the new masonry I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. I'm sorry, Italian isn't my first language, or my second language, or a third language I'm probably going to say. Except this is Latin. Either way, they say it in Assassin's Creed. Give me a second. Requiescat. Requiescat in pace. There we go. Requiescat in pace. Alright, that's all I've got for the evening, because the rest of my books are going to be long odysseys that we need to give their own episodes. But I hope you guys enjoyed the short foray into vintage horror, as I'd put it. Oh goodness gracious! What's this coming week happening? This coming Monday, there's another episode of Frozen Tundra not Frozen Tundra Finds. There's another episode of Orbiant, so feel free to give that a watch. I think that's the 3rd episode of Orbiant that's coming up this Monday. That's the last one where I am pontificating at length about, just life, the universe, and everything. Real, Douglas Adams sort of stuff. What else? Tuesday, Dungeons and Dragons, as usual now. I'm really glad we settled on a time that could include everyone in the group, because I was worried it wasn't going to include poor Raz. What else? Wednesday, variety stream game, as usual. We're actually going to finish the Strong Bad School game for attractive people, and then finally move on to something else this Wednesday. And then that coming Friday next, we're probably going to read, we'll either lean into the horror theme and start in on Dracula, or give Miss Helena Grace Wells a good nod and start in on probably one of the H.G. Wells novels I have. Probably The Invisible Man. It's a good one. And depending on how long Invisible Man takes me, we might go after Around the World in 80 Days. But we'll definitely go for Invisible Man next time. That's it for paper cuts this week, and you know what's coming for next week, so feel free to get involved with that. Anyway, this has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.